Hi everyone, in this video we'll talk about the cbind function in R. So we have already seen how rbind works. Now we'll see how cbind works. Rbind is for rows bind, cbind is for columns bind. So if we have two data frames, we want to attach columns of second data frame to the first data frame, we just bind them together. That's all that this function does, right? But what are the practical scenarios where you might need this to happen? Right? So let's assume that there was a maths test and a science test conducted for same 20 students in a particular class, right? On 2 different days, right? That's a very common thing that happens. All students appeared for maths and the same students appeared for science as well. But there are two data sets in which the information is collected. And you would like to just see one roll number with their math scores and science scores side by side to just see, okay, if maybe one student is lacking in maths or science, or like, they are doing good in both of them, right? So what do you do in that case? So this chunk of code will actually address a practical question like this one. So before we start anything, we'll use a function rmlist is equal to ls, which clears the environment, and we should clear the console using control plus L. Look out for the video on the top right if you haven't checked it out already. This is a very helpful function which we should use before starting any script. Now moving on, we'll create two data sets, random data sets. You don't need to know the code for that. This is just for this video purposes that I'll create so that I can operate on it using the function cbind, right? So df1 will be math scores for roll numbers 1 through 20, and df2 will be science scores for roll numbers 1 through 20, right? And I'll run this chunk and we'll get these two data frames in the environment. So you can just open df1 and you can see id and math scores for 1 to 20 roll numbers. Similarly, if you open df2, we'll see ID and science scores for roll numbers 1 to 20, right? Okay, going back to the chunk. Now, before moving ahead with combining the data frame columns, one thing we need to make sure and remember is that both the columns should have the same ID if we are binding something to it. So remember, we are binding, not merging, right? For merging, there's a separate video where we actually merge based on whatever the value is there in the ID cell. You can check out that video on the top right hand corner. This process of binding, we need to make sure that the alignment of two data sets is perfect. Otherwise, this function will not work and will give you an erroneous data frame which won't be of use to you or your analysis further, right? So we need to make sure that the ID column is exactly the same in these both data sets if we are combining columns, right? So upon observation from df1 and df2, you can see that there are roll calls 8, 13 and 6 in the first three rows, and in df2 you can see roll calls of 7, 17, 1. So right now, if I bind these two columns, I'll get science scores for roll number 7, roll number 17 and roll number 1 in front of math scores of roll number 18 and roll number 13 and roll number 6, which is incorrect, right? I don't want that. So to avoid that, I sort both of these data sets by the column ID from 1 through 20, right? So just like in the rbind video, we use dplyr package to pipe the data set from the arrange function that's present in the package. And it's a very simple line. You can see in this chunk, we just use the pipe operator, this percentage greater than percentage. We pass the df1 through arrange ID. It just arranges as a default from ascending order, right? So if I pass this chunk, you'll see that the data sets will remain the same, but now they have been sorted from 1 through 20, right? So now this gives us identical ID columns with which we can bind the data sets. So now we see that both ID columns are sorted and we can bind the columns and create a new data frame. So just like function rbind, which was so simple to use, is like rbind data frame 1, data frame 2, cbind has the exact same syntax, exact same way to operate, right? So we make a new data frame called df combine, cbind data frame 1, data frame 2, and I execute this chunk. I can see a df combine made. Now in df combine, you can see that the df2, which was ID science, ID maths, this is the new df combine which has all the 4 columns of ID maths and ID science. Now you understand the reason why I wanted ID columns to be exact. Right now you can see that they are perfectly in a particular way. Roll number 1 had math score of 59 and roll number 1 had science score of 37. Right? So this is the way you can quality check your new data frame creations if you're using functions like rbind or cbind, right? Okay, but if you see the data frame, we have ID column repeated twice. Should we have that? I don't think so, right? We should remove one of them because it's just a repetition. We won't use that in our analysis anyways. It's just a key for every student, right? Why should we have it twice? So to remove the ID column, we'll just do a df combine, open square brackets, because in square brackets it's like rows, comma, columns. So data frame, square brackets, rows, comma, columns, we can operate on any data frame. So what I did is I opened the data frame in the square brackets. I don't want to remove or add anything in the rows. What I want to do is remove a column. So I'll use a subtraction sign minus column 3, right? So this is how you remove a column as well in a data set. You just add minus C 3, and the third column will be removed. So let's run this chunk and show you the result. So if you see now, df combined earlier had 20 observations of 4 variables, now it has 20 observations of 3 variables. And when I click on it, boom, ID, maths and science, the third column of ID is removed, right? So this will help you in making a neat data frame on which you can begin your analysis moving on. So here is the final desired output using cbind in R, which is very straightforward function. You don't need to know much theory for it. It's just that one thing you need to always remember is cbind does not care of order of your rows. It will just bind the column as it is. So you need to make sure that the data sets that you're working on are perfectly aligned in terms of the key operator or the key ID column that you're using in both of them. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one. Hope you enjoyed it. Cheers.